Well, good morning, folks. Nice to see you all. And thanks for dropping by. I will be with you shortly. Okay. Today's class was actually as a result of a request by Ernest. He asked to explain the concept of Birur Hanitzutzos, as it's called, clarifying or elevating the sparks. Now, before we begin that, let me just start with a story, as I promised I would. This is a story about the famous Rebbe known as the Tzemach Tzedek. The Tzemach Tzedek was he was the third Rebbe of the third spiritual leader of the Chabad or Lubavitch movement. Very, very well known, prolific author, wrote many works. And this is it's a straightforward, simple story, but it contains with it many of the roots of what we're going to talk about today. So let me begin with a story. As was customary, many of the spiritual leaders would travel around to various places in order to visit their followers and to, spread the teachings that they were accustomed to spread and to teach. And so to the Tzemach Tzedek did the same thing. His name was actually Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Lubavitch, but they call him the Tzemach Tzedek after a book that he wrote, one of the books that he wrote called the Tzemach Tzedek. In any event, so he was traveling around and he got to a certain city named Usio. And there, of course, many people came to greet him and to welcome him and so on and so forth to the town. And along with them, the people that came to visit him and came to talk to him was someone who was a shochet. A shochet is a ritual slaughterer. In other words, somebody who slaughters animals and birds for kosher production. As you probably all know, kosher doesn't only involve the type of food that you eat, but also how it's prepared. For example, as everybody probably knows, we wouldn't eat. Jews are forbidden to eat things like bats and birds of prey and things like that. And there's only certain kosher birds that we are allowed to eat. Amongst them, obviously, chickens and turkey. Although there are some people that do not eat turkey, but let's leave that aside for a minute. And as well as amongst animals, it would be, cows and sheep and goats are permissible, and some wild animals as well, deer, anything with split hooves and chews the cud, which excludes many wild animals. Also obviously excludes pigs and various other types of animals. Amongst the birds that exclude is ostrich. In any event, okay, so we all understand that there's restrictions on the type of food, but there's also restrictions on how that food is prepared. First of all, how it's slaughtered. Slaughtering of the animal is done with an extremely sharp knife, dangerously sharp, which may not have any nicks in it or any unevenness in it, because that could possibly cause the animal pain. So the way it's done is the knife is used to quickly pass over the neck, and that severs the main arteries, and the animal is within seconds. Does not have any, basically doesn't have any life force left in it. Okay, so that's the way it's prepared. Then there's also preparation. There's the meat. The meat has to be koshered. The blood has to be removed by salting it and washing it and salting it and washing it again. And only then can it be actually prepared for eating. So the person that came, one of the people that came to visit them at Tzemach Tzedek was a shochet, a ritual slaughterer, someone who was expert in the laws of shchita, of slaughtering animals. And when he came before the Tzemach Tzedek, as was customary, the Tzemach Tzedek asked him if he wanted a blessing for anything in particular. And then he gave him time to ask questions. And one of the questions that the shochet asked is, he said like this: in earlier generation, there seemed to be far fewer restrictions on kosher food than there are in our generations, in later generations, because layers of stringencies keep on being added through the generations. Now, does that mean, he asked, this shochet asked, does that mean that earlier generations were eating food that was essentially not kosher? So the Tzemach Tzedek answered, and he said, no, of course it doesn't mean that. It simply means that the further generations get on, the further with the descent of the generations, the stringencies increase, because it is more difficult to elevate the sparks within the food that we eat unless greater stringencies are observed. That was basically the end of the story, but this story also has a tremendous amount of, it gives us a good understanding of what it is, what the kosher laws are all about, and why it is that there are so many restrictions on what to eat, how to prepare it, and so on and so forth. What's this all about? So in order to be able to understand that, we have to go all the way back to the beginning of creation. Right in the beginning of creation, after the first creation, the creation of light, so it says like this: Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then it continues like this: Va'aretz hayata tohu vavohu. And the earth was, tohu means chaos, vohu means void, chaos and void. That's at least the way it's usually translated, although there are other translations. So, in the beginning, everything was chaos and void, and then was the first utterance, let there be light, or there shall be light, Vayi or, and there was light. Okay, so the Kabbalistic works, particularly the Arizal, the Zohar and the Arizal, Rabbi Yitzhak Luria, a famous Kabbalist from Sfat in the 1500s, whose gravesite I just visited, and the author of the Zohar, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in Miron, whose gravesite I just visited on my trip. We stopped by in Israel for a few days. So they write that this Tohu Vavohu is a previous form of creation. I've spoken about this before, but just to recap briefly. It's a form of creation which was created in order to be destroyed, and destroyed in order to be recreated or reconstituted. Now, what does that mean? That means that the world of Tohu fell apart. It smashed into many, many shards, or into many sparks, as they call them. Now, this wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an error in the creation. It was deliberately done. This weakness in the world of Tohu was deliberately built in order that world would be smashed, and then it would be reconstituted through us doing various activities, which I'll discuss in a minute. So, the actual language is that the vessels of the world of Tohu, there are two things. In every world, there are two things. There are lights and vessels, or the light of the Sphira and the Sphira. The Sphira is really essentially the vessel that we're talking about. Sphira, divine emanations. So there's emanations, divine emanations, which have two parts. The animating energy of that world, and how that energy is designed and contained. So the containment procedure, or what we call vessels, or kalim in Hebrew, the vessels were very immature. They were made to be immature so that they would smash. And the purpose of them smashing was so that they would be distributed, redistributed throughout creation, through the various worlds. The world of Tohu comes before the world of Atzilut. There are 4 worlds spoken about in Kabbalah. Atzilut, Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya, the world of emanation, the world of creation, the world of formation, and the world of action. Atzilut, Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya. But prior to them was the world of Tohu. Now, the world of Tohu, as we said, smashed into 288 sparks initially. It comes from the word, if you, again, right in the beginning of Genesis, in the first few verses, where it says, Va'aretz hayta tohu vavohu, the world was tohu and vohu, it was tohu and it was chaos and void. V'ruach Elokim merachefet al pnei hamayim, and the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. Now let me just write in the chat box over here the word merachefet. For some reason it's not going. Oh, here we go. Okay, it's in... all right, merachefet. I'm just going to write it first in English and then write it in Hebrew. Merachefet. Merachefet. All right, but in Hebrew, it would be written like this. Merachefet. Now, the word merachefet, say the Kabbalists, is really the letters rapach, mate. Or in English, let me just do that in English, rapach, mate. Rapach, mate means that 288 died. Oh, there's no screen sharing? Oh, no, I'm doing it in the chat box. I'm doing it in the chat box, so it should. Can everyone see it? No? If you can open your chat box, chat box, maybe that's the reason, I don't know. Yeah, can you see it now? No? No, why should that be? Check everyone in the chat. Oh, I don't know how that happened. Wait a second. Everyone, sorry. Okay, now can you see it? No. All right. Here we go again. This is... All right, let's try this again. 1 second. 1 second. All right. Can you see it now? Bingo. Okay, you got it. Sorry, I was sharing it privately. I don't know how that happened because I didn't make a private message. But anyway, okay. Very good. Okay, so that is, let me just write that again. Rapach, mate. Right? Rapach met means that the 288 sparks died. Died means they fell down. So the word merachefet, which we translate literally as hovering, the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. So the Kabbalists explain that means rapach mate. The 288 sparks died. In other words, they fell down from their level to a lower level. Now, these 288 sparks then disintegrated even further. And some of them were absorbed in the highest of worlds, in the world of Atzilut. Some were absorbed in the world of Bria. Some were absorbed in Yetzira. Some were absorbed in the world of Asiya. And some were not even absorbed in the world of Asiya, and they fell down into what is called Klippa, into spiritual impurity, into a state of spiritual impurity. Now, many of the laws of the Torah, the way the Kabbalists explain them, and particularly when it comes to using things of this world, and in particular eating things in this world, they are designed to restrict us from pushing those sparks further into impurity. on the one hand. On the other hand, they're designed to elevate those sparks from the state of encumbrance. Encumbrance means that they're just captured in something else. And our duty, our job is to release those sparks and re-elevate them, to reconstitute the vessels in order to elicit the light that was originally invested in the world of Tohu. Because what happened when the vessels shattered is that all the light that was contained in those vessels, which was tremendously powerful, and that's why the vessels shattered, that light returned to its source. Once the vessels are reconstituted, then the light can be elicited again and can be brought down once again into the reconstituted vessels. So many of the laws of kashrut, of kosher, the kosher laws, are in particular are there to ensure that those sparks that can be elevated are elevated, and those that cannot be elevated are not, we don't deal with them in order not to pull ourselves down into that level of spiritual impurity. There is a way for those other sparks that were buried now in spiritual impurity to be elevated. That can be done through someone who's called a Baal Tshuva, someone who returns to the way of Torah, even though to the ways of the Torah, even though maybe he wasn't born into it, or maybe he wasn't. He was born into it, but went away, and then he came back. Coming back brings all those things that he came into contact with, all those things, if it's a sincere returnee, that elevates those sparks. Also, those sparks are elevated by people who take upon themselves to convert to Judaism. All the sparks that they have with them are then brought into, by them, are brought into holiness through the process of conversion. And that's why many of the converts in Jewish history were extremely elevated and spiritually very, very powerful people. Shmaya, Naftalion, Rabbi Meir, Onkelos, many others, and they were very extremely highly regarded as being very, very lofty souls. In any event, this gives us an understanding of what is called in the Torah mutar and Ruth. Yeah, exactly, Ruth. That's a perfect example. Ruth was a convert to Judaism. That's a biblical convert already. So, and there's a whole book called the Book of Ruth that we have in her merit. King David descended from Ruth. So, the word for forbidden in Hebrew is asur. I'll just type it in the box. And the word for permitted is mutar. Asur and mutar. Now, literally these words, mutar and asur mean, or asur means bound. Asur means bound, and mutar means unbound. Now, what does it mean, bound and unbound? When we say that the sparks are bound in impurity, that means they cannot be elevated in the normal course of things, except by returnees and by converts. But most of the sparks are not bound into impurity so closely, so tightly that they cannot be released. They're only bound lightly, or to put it a little bit more accurately, there are 3 levels of impurity and 1 level which is partially impure. The 3 levels of impurity we cannot in the normal course of things elevate. The 1 level of partial impurity, it's called noga, or actually klipat noga. Klipat noga. Noga means a glow. It's not light, but it has the possibility of becoming light. It's a klipa, it's the shell which is called noga. There's 3 impure shells which we cannot elevate, and there's 1 shell which the things from which can be elevated. Now, what is in the category of klipat noga? What is there? Well, for example, for example, kosher animals and kosher food in general is in klipat noga. So when you prepare it in the right way, slaughter it in the right way, and prepare it in the right way, and not mixing milk and meat and things like that, and then consume it, and then use the energy that a person receives from the food that he ate in order to pray, in order to study Torah, in order to do good deeds, and so on and so forth, that elevates the spark within that particular object. So when the spark is bound, it cannot be unbound in the normal course of things. When it's unbound, or it's only bound in noga, in klipat noga, then it can be elevated. And that's what the whole process of elevating the sparks is all about. Now, what does that mean? That means that the everything that a person comes into contact with, everything he consumes for energy, for food, a person's possessions, physical possessions, as long as they are acquired honestly, all contain sparks from the world of Tohu, and all of them are elevated by using these things for spiritual purposes as well as for the mundane purposes that they use, for that they are intended for. For example, let's say a person has some money. Just for example, in that money is also buried certain sparks. He earned it honestly, so those sparks can be elevated. When a person gives, let's say, 10% to charity, to a worthy charity, so the rest of the 90 is all elevated. The rest of the 90%, the 90 cents in the dollar is elevated. It's now, so to speak, pure money or holy money. Same thing is true of food. By making a blessing over the food before we eat it and after we eat it, that elevates the food, as long as, of course, the food is kosher and it's not acquired by theft or things like that. And that basically is many of the rules, many of the laws of the Torah have to do with unbinding the sparks that are buried in noga, in klipat noga. That's what it's all about. Now, very often, in fact, probably most of the time, people are not even aware of this and not thinking of this kind of thing. They're not thinking about it. But there are occasions where a person can come across a certain situation in which you find yourself getting tremendous energy from something that you wouldn't have expected. And therefore, you can understand that was probably a spark somewhere along the line that became elevated through your action. There's a story from the Baal Shem Tov that actually illustrates this. There was a certain disciple of the Baal Shem Tov that was told to, the Baal Shem Tov told him to go on a certain journey, to go to a certain place. And on the way, on the journey, he stopped off, and he got tremendously thirsty, extremely thirsty, and he didn't have any water with him. So he went looking for a well or a spring or a river or whatever. In those days, you could drink from you could drink from the rivers and the springs, huh? But anyway, he was out in the fields or whatever, out in the woods, open countryside, and eventually he did find a spring, and he drank from the water there. He made a blessing. He was so thirsty that he almost forgot to make a blessing, but just as he was about to drink, he remembered to make a blessing, and he made a blessing on the water, and then he drank the water, and then made a blessing afterwards, and he went did the mission that he was supposed to do, and then he came back to the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov told him that what you did over there when you became thirsty, without him telling the Baal Shem Tov the whole story, he even forgot about it. He wasn't even aware that this had happened. But the Baal Shem Tov told him, when you got very, very thirsty and you went to look for some water, so there was a spark that has been buried in creation for a very long time that was awaiting its elevation. And you almost didn't elevate it because you almost forgot to make a blessing. But when you made the blessing, and then afterwards made a blessing after you drank the water, and then you went with the energy and the strength that you got from drinking that water, you went and fulfilled the mission that I sent you on, that elevated that spark. And so it was that that particular person got a tremendous amount of, he himself got a tremendous amount of energy and spiritual sustenance from this particular incident. So therefore, the whole concept of elevating sparks becomes not just a personal endeavor, but it also becomes something which affects the entire world. Because when all the sparks are reconstituted and elevated, at least elevated from where they are now up to a higher level, when all those sparks are elevated, that'll be the time that the vessels will automatically be reconstituted, and that'll become the Messianic era. In other words, when all things are returned restored to a state of wholeness, that'll be essentially the Messianic era. And those people, everybody who participated, obviously, gets their spiritual reward for doing so. They'll be able to see the spiritual origin of all the sparks that they elevated, and will thereby themselves be elevated. Now, this doesn't only occur on one level. In other words, it doesn't only occur in the world of Asiya, where most of the sparks are. It occurs in all of the worlds. However, the sparks in the higher worlds that were already absorbed into the higher worlds, the higher sparks that were absorbed into the higher worlds, have already been elevated by previous generations. The lower the generation, the further down the line the generation is from the beginning of creation, the further down the line we are from when the Torah was given to the Jewish people, the more difficult it is to elevate the sparks. The smaller the sparks are and the more deeply buried they are. Doesn't mean that the sparks therefore are of a lower origin. They all have the same origin. On the contrary, the lower they fall, usually the higher their source. And that's why we have stringencies today, which you don't find in biblical commandments. The biblical commandments don't necessarily require these stringencies, but the further on we go, the more difficult it is to disencumber, to release and free and elevate those sparks. Now, it happens in the world of Asiya. It also happens once the sparks have been lifted to one level, then they may be lifted again in other ways to a second level, to a third level, higher and higher and higher, until they eventually reach their source, and their source in the broken vessels, and that reconstitutes the vessels, and therefore elicits the light. Now, Gloria asked a very good question. Since most of us do not do this, is that the reason why the world is so crazy? Yes, that's definitely part of it. That is definitely part of it. The closer we get towards the releasing of all the sparks, the crazier the world gets, the more strange things. It's like Alice in Wonderland kind of thing. Things that you wouldn't have in earlier generations would have been just completely puzzling and strange and weird, but today are considered absolutely normal. And that's because a lot of what goes on is because of the energy of these buried sparks. But I wouldn't say that most of us do not do this, Gloria. It's not necessarily true. You might do it, but in a way that is there's sort of partnerships, spiritual partnerships in these kinds of things that, you know, your friendship with a person who is involved in it, or I would even venture to say studying classes like these also helps to elevate those sparks that you have come into contact with. And even though you might not necessarily be following the laws of the Torah, but in some way or another, it's very possible that some of the sparks have, I don't want to say relationships is not the real way to put it, but they have ramifications. And if some of the ramifications are dealt with by other people, not necessarily yourself, then the spark becomes slowly sort of released. Not as quick as a procedure, but it also happens that way. Okay, I'll take questions now. Any questions, anybody? Every astrological soul is high, medium, or pedestrian and low life members. Do the sparks mediate this? Well, it has not only to do with the sparks, but it also has to do with the level of soul that the person is born with. In other words, his particular soul history, or if you want to call it his various possible previous incarnations and so on and so forth. But yes, it also has to do with the sparks that he has been given, that soul root has been given to elevate. Let me just explain what I mean. There are only 600,000 soul roots altogether. There's 600,000 soul roots. Those 600,000 soul roots divide into many, many subdivisions. And it could be that, 100, 1,000, 10,000, even 1,000,000 people belong to the same soul root. Each soul root is given a task of elevating certain sparks and doing certain actions in the world that elevate those sparks. So, if one person doesn't do it, that person is given another chance through a second reincarnation and so on. But if it still doesn't happen, eventually someone else in that soul root cluster is going to have to do it. So, therefore, it could be that a person comes into this world simply to do things which are not seemingly his function in the world, but seem to be doing something for others. Now, this is all very complex stuff, and without going into it in great detail, that's basically what's happening. Very often, we seem to be sort of misfits in our own skin, and sometimes a person is a misfit in his own skin because he's not really doing anything in his own skin, so to speak. He's there to do something that has to do with his soul root, but not necessarily with his particular physical history or his reincarnation history. Let's put it that way. Hope that makes it clear, although it probably doesn't. But okay, our sparks associated within us and others, and if we do help elevate those sparks associated with each other, including asking others to be the best we can be, all be yes. That definitely elevates the sparks. Anything that we do to improve the world around us, that's called the world of tikkun. The whole concept of elevating sparks is part of this whole concept of tikkun. Tikkun means rectification. It's rectifying the world. It's fixing up. Literally, tikkun means to fix the broken vessels. And that's what the whole concept is really about. And tikkun means behaving, particularly behaving, but also thinking and speaking, but particularly behaving in ways that are conducive to peace in the world, to love and friendship, to right rather than wrong, to good and not evil, and so on. Hope that answers that. Can the concept of sparks or perhaps concealed spirituality be seen in other people that we are attracted to? Yes. And that we desire to impact with? Yes. Might this be a clue that there is a spark there? Yes, absolutely. Right. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. All right, let's call it a day. And See you again Wednesday. Are sparks elevated only through food? No, not necessarily. No, through any action in the world. It could be elevated also through thought, through speech, through any action in the world, including just ordinary possessions that we have. But certainly through eating is one of them, and that's in some ways one of the main ones. But it could be many other ways as well. All right. Thank you very much, everybody, and see you Wednesday.